along with Emily McGee and Crystal Hardy from Mosaic Interpreting Services, who will be providing ASL interpretation. If you would like to hear today's panel in Spanish, please select interpretation in the meeting controls at the bottom of your screen. If you are a member of the press attending today's event, there will be opportunities to follow up with today's presenters after this event. The mission of Voices is to champion public policies that improve the lives of Virginia's children. In direct response to the impact on children and families of the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and racism, Virginia's Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week was founded in 2020. The precursor of Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia was the Campaign for a Trauma-Informed Virginia. Trauma-informed care acknowledges the disparate impact of trauma on communities of color. When trauma is experienced collectively by communities, whether geographically, culturally, racially, or ethnically, this is a systemic issue. Therefore, as champions for policy change, Voices recognizes that the systems that perpetuate trauma and long-term inequities and disparities must be dismantled. Through the Racial Truth and Reconciliation campaign, we accomplish two things. First, we engage communities in championing their own solutions authentically in recognition that truth-telling promotes healing and reconciliation. Secondly, we collaboratively identify solutions to address the root causes of inequities. Ultimately, through the campaign, we champion trauma and equity-informed policies to ensure a healthy and just future for children, youth, and families in Virginia. This is the second Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week in Virginia, officially proclaimed as such by Governor Ralph Northam. Thank you very much, Governor. Along with this event, Voices and our partners have planned a week of virtual and in-person activities that we invite you to participate in. These events range from panels to community chats to mindfulness activities and even back to school yoga. I invite you to visit vakids.org for the full list of events. For now, on behalf of Voices, I welcome you to participate in Virginia's second Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. Of course, one of the highlights of the week is this panel presentation, Virginia Leads on a Just Future for Children and Families. Today, Governor Northam will kick off the panel, and then we will be joined by several partners from his administration and leaders representing other statewide organizations and advisory groups focused on creating a more diverse and equitable Commonwealth. Before he was inaugurated as the 73rd governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia, Ralph Northam served as an Army doctor, pediatric neurologist, business owner, state senator, and lieutenant governor. A native of Virginia's Eastern Shore, Governor Northam was educated at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, where he graduated with distinction. After graduation, Governor Northam was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He served 8 years of active duty and rose to the rank of major. He attended Eastern Virginia Medical School and began a career in neurology, working at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, Johns Hopkins Hospital, and Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters in Northam. Governor Northam approaches public service with the same passion he brought to his military and medical service. He is committed to working with leaders from both parties to build a Virginia that works better for every family, no matter who they are or where they live. In August 2020, Governor Ralph Northam recognized Virginia's first Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week through a proclamation and at the statewide town hall on racial equity and police reform. The proclamation was critical in recognizing the role Virginia leaders play in the acknowledgement of the truths and experiences of communities of color, and furthermore, intentionally dismantling systems and structures of oppression so that all community members have equitable access to positive health outcomes, culturally empowering environments and connections, and are free from prejudice and discrimination. And this week, the governor has introduced a similar proclamation for the second Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. We are thankful for the progress the Northam administration and the panelists joining us today have made. And again, we are grateful to our interpreters. If you wish to access Spanish translation through the Zoom meeting, you may select that option in the control panel and make sure to pin video for our ASL interpreters. With that, welcome, Governor Ralph Northam. We look forward to hearing your comments today and to hearing from the experts working within your team.
Well, good morning to everybody, and thanks so much, Cece, for the kind introduction and also for inviting me to join you today as part of this year's Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week programming. I was proud, as you just mentioned, to proclaim Virginia's first Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week last year and to do it again this year. We thought that 2020 had been a tumultuous year, but I will tell you, 2021 is giving us a run for our money. These past 18 months have really put a spotlight on issues that we have known about for years. The inequities in our healthcare system, our justice system, our education system, really all of our systems. And we have seen these inequities highlighted on two fronts: health inequities and racial injustice. The pandemic continues to show us how where you live or who you are really makes a difference in the kind of healthcare that you get. There's no question that people of color have experienced disparities in getting COVID and in getting vaccinated against COVID. We have seen which jobs can be done from home and which can't. We've seen which students have the broadband access to attend school virtually and which don't. And the racial justice protests that rose nationwide last year after the killing of George Floyd and too many other Black people, it really reinforced the overdue need to create real change, both to our symbols and to our systems. Now, we have worked hard in my administration to elevate efforts to make our Commonwealth more inclusive and to ensure that we are telling the full and true story of our shared history. Exactly 2 years ago today, I was at Fort Monroe as the Commonwealth marked 400 years since the arrival of the first enslaved African people on Virginia's shores. Just up the river from Fort Monroe in Jamestown, a few weeks earlier, white landowning men had come together to establish a system of what they called representative government. Well, as you all know, that system did not represent all of the people who arrived at Old Point Comfort. People whose skin looked different than mine. For generations, it also failed to represent women. And as we observe Women's Equality Day on Thursday, we recognize that for many women, especially women of color, the challenges have been abundant. As a society and as a nation, we have been struggling to live up to our ideals of equality for everyone of the now 402 years since. We continue to reckon with our painful and complex past, acknowledging that it still shapes our present and working to improve our future. Over the past 18 months, we have seen how long-standing health inequities have made people of color more vulnerable to COVID and less likely to be vaccinated. We created a health equity working group early in the pandemic to help make sure that those issues remain at the forefront of our policy making. They helped make sure we were targeting things like testing and PPE to communities that might not otherwise have easy access. And when vaccines came along early this year, that same group helped us get the shots into vulnerable communities. For anyone listening, if you have not been vaccinated, please, please, please go get your shot. They're safe, they're effective, they're free, and they are saving lives. I am proud that this administration has taken strong steps to increase equity in our state government and in our laws and policies. And we have taken and continue to take steps to really dig out discrimination from our laws and from our systems. We have passed laws to reform our criminal justice system to make it more equitable, from laws like Breonna's Law and the Marcus Alert to abolishing the death penalty and legalizing marijuana use. We have had difficult conversations around race and policing reform and taking steps to make law enforcement more accountable while increasing their training and their connection to the communities that they serve. We've taken steps to protect people from discrimination, such as expanding hate crimes designation, creating a statewide office of New Americans, and banning discrimination on the basis of gender, sexual orientation, and disability. We've also removed outdated laws with discriminatory language from our books, and we declared racism a public health crisis. Ultimately, we all share the goal of reforming systems, but symbols still matter. Monuments and statues that were erected to celebrate and reinforce racism, they have no place here. So we've worked very hard to take them down, and we'll replace them with monuments that reflect a more inclusive Virginia. We've invested in museums and other historical and cultural organizations that are working to tell our full and comprehensive story. And we have developed training and materials for our teachers so they have a better understanding of our history, so they can teach our children the complete story. In 2019, we were the first state to hire a director of diversity, equity, and inclusion, Dr. Janice Underwood. Dr. Underwood and her team have worked hard over the past many months to develop the One Virginia plan to root diversity and inclusion in all levels of our state government. And I want to tell you, Dr. Underwood and her team have just done an amazing job. And so on behalf of Virginia, thank you so much. They've been working hard hand in hand with agencies to help them develop their own plans. And this is so important for the people who work in state government and for every Virginian they serve. So there is always more work to do in the rest of my term and for the next governor. Our children deserve to grow up in a society that recognizes the problems of the past, acknowledges how they impact the present, and works to make the future better. We have taken tremendous strides in that direction, and I look forward to continuing that work right up until my last day in this office. So thank you all for the work that you do for our children and families. Now you'll hear from some folks from our team who are here to talk with you about the many exciting policy efforts that we're working on. So I expect this will be a powerful and informative conversation. Cece, thank you so much again for your introduction, and thanks for having me here with you today. And I'll turn it over to you as the moderator. Thank you all so much, and stay safe.
Thank you, Governor Northam. Thank you to you and your team for helping to ensure the success of this week. We look forward to working with you, and we look forward to working with future administrations to ensure children in Virginia have equal access, equal opportunities, and welcoming opportunities. Next, we will transition to our panel to share additional examples of the types of policy changes that have been enacted during the Northam administration. I would like to introduce Chloe Edwards, a policy analyst at Voices for Virginia's Children, who will serve as our moderator. She focuses on the policies that impact children's social determinants of health, including access to care, community resilience, and more. In 2020, Chloe launched Virginia's first Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. Now the initiative has evolved into a campaign that empowers marginalized communities. During the 2021 General Assembly session, Chloe helped lead efforts to successfully recognize racism as a public health crisis in Virginia, making the state the first in the South to do so. In 2021, Chloe was recognized by the Valentine History Center as a Richmond history maker and by the YWCA of Greater Richmond for an Outstanding Women Award. And she was also named on Style Weekly's Top 40 Under 40. Chloe holds a Master of Public Policy in Leadership from Liberty University and completed the Minority Research and Law Institute program at Southern University, the University of Virginia's Sorensen Institute for Political Emerging Leaders program, and the Virginia Progressive Leadership Project in 2021. She currently serves as University of Richmond Community Partner in Residence to complete a multidisciplinary racial equity and social justice framework for Voices for Virginia's Children. Chloe is also the founder, president, and CEO of Chloe Edwards Consulting and president of Black Lives Matter 804. So I'll turn it over to you, Chloe.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us and getting us started. Thank you to members of the administration and to Governor Northam as well. Hello, everyone, and welcome once again. Today, through this conversation, we will address the progress Virginia has made towards the goal of a just future for Virginia's children, youth, and families. Following, we will discuss the work that is left to be done to advance trauma-informed care and equity and justice in policy. I'd like to first introduce the panelists joining us today by reading a short version of your biography. I want to first thank you for your incredible work, all of the work that each of you all are doing. After I read your biography, I'd like to invite you to optionally elaborate on any of your personal identities and experiences, whether seen or unseen, that contributes to the great passion for the work you all are doing. I'll first provide an example before we begin of what that will look like. My name is Chloe Edwards. As mentioned, I'm a policy analyst at Voices for Virginia's Children. I identify as a Black woman, a triplet raised by a single mother, an alumna of Virginia's kinship foster care system. I grew up in middle class, but lived in poverty as we were house poor. My mother, however, wanted us to go to a school with a good reputation, and so there were sacrifices made. As a PTSD survivor, I'm extremely passionate about trauma-informed care. And as the daughter of a recovering addict that faced the cycle of drug use and incarceration, I am extremely passionate about justice. These are the experiences that contribute to the work that I do on the Racial Truth and Reconciliation Virginia campaign. So let's go ahead and get us started. I'll first introduce Dr. Janice Underwood. Dr. Janice Underwood was appointed by Governor Ralph Northam as the Commonwealth of Virginia's first cabinet-level chief diversity officer. This position is also the first of its kind in the nation. As the Commonwealth's CDO, she is committed to addressing racial, ethnic, disability, gender-based, and other cultural inequities in formal and informal policies in Virginia state government. Specifically, Dr. Underwood has worked collaboratively to build the One Virginia mission, the first ever statewide strategic plan for the inclusive excellence across over 100 agencies and with other public and private sectors. In this historical role, which provides a roadmap for building diversity-led innovation in local, state, and federal government, Dr. Underwood was named one of 20 agents of change in 2020 by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for the measurable accomplishments, impact, and racial reconciliation she already had on the Commonwealth. As part of her role, she guides the state's COVID-19 Equity Leadership Task Force, which directs the work of the Unified Command Health Equity Working Group, various equity audits for the state agencies, and the implementation of equity principles and public messaging, crisis management, and community engagement. Her goal is to make Virginia an exemplar for the nation regarding diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence. Welcome, Janice. I'd like to invite you to participate in the diversity welcome and to add any additional information within your comfort zone. What experience shaped the work that you do today?
Well, good morning, Chloe, and to my esteemed panelists and to the governor. It's an honor to be here. Well, my intersectionality includes being a mother, a wife, but also a career-long or lifetime educator. And so I spent more than 16, 17 years teaching students, all students, a love of science, particularly those for which English was not their first language and had limited English proficiency, students with learning disabilities and emotional disabilities, as well as everything from those who live in poverty and those who have been sort of marginalized in American schooling. And so that work really shaped who I am today and what I fight for, and the frameworks by which I've applied in this position to create the One Virginia Plan. I am very committed, as you say, passionate about justice. How do we leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion to foster justice? And those are some difficult conversations to have, especially with people who believe they are advancing justice, right? We need to have these tough conversations. And to me, I'm a bridge for empowering people to have those conversations. And so I bring my intersectionality as an educator, because I believe that if you can learn to be marginalizing, and if you can learn to be racist, because racism is learned. The governor often says that no baby is born into this world hating anyone, right? You can also unlearn it. And so my role is to help leaders at all levels and residents of all levels learn more about how to operate with inclusive excellence.
Thank you. I'll pass the mic to my colleague, Emily, to introduce our next panelist. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our next panelist will introduce Chidema Jenkins. Chidi as the governor's special advisor on childhood trauma and resilience, where she supports statewide trauma-informed public and private networks and aligns efforts with the Children's Cabinet Trauma-Informed Care Working Group, the Trauma-Informed Leadership Team, the TILT, and Virginia Heals. Prior to her appointment, Chidi served as a special assistant in the Office of the Secretary of Education. Before joining the Northam administration, she was a second grade teacher and focused on children's social and emotional learning, diversity and inclusion, digital tools and technology, and environmental education. A native of Ann Arbor, Michigan, Chidi earned her BA degree in French language and literature and a Master of Teaching from the University of Virginia. Welcome, Chidi. We've had two great examples of adding some additional diversity discussion. I would like you to add any additional information within your comfort zone. What experiences have shaped the work that you do today?
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Chloe. It was so good to hear the additional parts of your life that maybe aren't in a bio. So Dr. Underwood, thank you also for sharing. As Emily mentioned, my name is Chidi Jenkins, and I am originally from Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I'm maybe at least the first Midwesterner to be on the panel today, at least. I am the eldest of three children. My mother is American, she is white, and my dad is Nigerian. He immigrated here in his 30s to pursue education, higher education. And I identify as African American primarily, but also as a mixed person, knowing that the experience of having two cultures, two races within my home, and also a home that spoke multiple languages within it. There's just a lot that goes on, and certainly a lot of good food to eat. I am a wife. I'm also recently a new mother. I am a former educator, as Emily mentioned. And I would say that I bring my invaluable experiences from the classroom, teaching in Southeast DC, as well as in Arlington, Virginia, two starkly different communities and teaching environments to the work that I do today. I would say that my experiences with my students particularly and what their diverse and unique needs were are something that I always recall and remember as I think about the people and the individuals and the families who are behind and the recipients of the policies and the practices that we try and shape each and every day, thinking about how it will benefit them and their needs most. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's great to hear background on all of our esteemed panel and just that I'm loving the diversity in general in the room. It's a beautiful panel. I'd like to introduce Cecilia Barbossa next. Cecilia Barbossa is founder and principal of CBE Consulting that provides consultation in public health to community groups and private and public organizations. She has worked for over 20 years in the public health field here in the state of Virginia, including serving as Director of Division of Child and Adolescent Health for the Virginia Department of Health, serving as Executive Director of the Virginia Public Health Association. Previously, she worked as a planner at the Sarasota County Public Health Department and trained Peace Corps volunteers in the Dominican Republic. She is immediate past chair of the Virginia Latino Advisory Board and current chair of the Health Committee. Cecilia is also secretary of the board of the Jenkins Foundation and member of the board of Dancing Classrooms of Greater Richmond. She received a PhD in social and behavioral health from Virginia Commonwealth University, Master of Public Health and Master of City Planning degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, and a BA degree in biology from Smith College. She's a citizen of USA and Brazil. She is fluent in Portuguese, Spanish, and French. Welcome. I'd like to give you an opportunity to participate in the diversity welcome and would love to learn more about your background. What experience shaped the work that you do today?
Good morning, and very happy to be here. It's such a privilege to be a part of this group, and I thank you very much for inviting me to be a part of it. This is certainly a very important theme that we all need to talk about and participate in. So again, thank you. Well, a little bit about myself. We know that experiences in childhood are so important in shaping who we become as adults. And in my case, I was fortunate to become exposed to various cultures at a very early age, briefly because of my father's work. My father was Brazilian. By the age of 13, I had lived in 6 countries on 3 continents, living in countries where the language spoken was not one that I spoke at home. So I know what it's like to land in a classroom where I could not communicate with anybody and nobody could understand me. I had that experience twice as a young child in Brazil and in France. But with all these moves, I had a very strong nuclear family. My parents, I was mentioning, my father from Brazil, my mother from England, and now my husband from the Dominican Republic. So being among, like Chidi, being among many cultures is just part of who I am and has been for forever. So in terms of my beliefs, I do feel strongly that all children bring with them many strengths. And we need to develop systems, policies, and practices and welcoming environments so that all children can reach their potential, their full potential. In the case of Latinos and other immigrant communities, at a minimum, their gift to us is their culture and their language. And as a community, we will all benefit by helping all children feel welcome and included.
Thank you so much for sharing that powerful note. And I'd like to pass the mic to Emily to introduce our next panelist.
Our next panelist is Monica Sarmiento. Monica currently serves as the Executive Director of the Virginia Coalition for Immigrant Rights. The Virginia Coalition is a multiracial and multi-ethnic coalition of 43 organizations that exists to win dignity, power, and quality of life for all immigrant and refugee communities regardless of their legal status. The Virginia Coalition has been at the forefront of the passage of the driving privileges for undocumented Virginians, in-state tuition for undocumented students, the elimination of multiple law enforcement and ICE customs agreements with local municipalities, and recently led efforts on COVID-19 vaccination outreach events. In 2020, the coalition's victories led to positive policy change that uplifted the quality of life for over 500,000 Virginians. Ms. Sarmiento is a Salvadorian immigrant, a Virginia native, and has served as the executive director for over 6 years. Welcome, Monica. I'd like you to also participate in the diversity welcome and add any additional information that you would like to share with us today about your background and experience.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so incredibly grateful to Voices for Virginia's Children, as well as Governor Northam for kicking us off today, and all of the efforts that he has made to really make drastic changes in the Commonwealth and bringing about that gap in equity. And so to tell you a little bit about myself, I was born in El Salvador, which is a country in Central America at the height of the Civil War that was happening there. And so my very first memories on earth really have to do with witnessing destruction and chaos in the midst of that war that was happening. And so I very much have these dramatic memories of just how horrific those war scenes were. And so my mother made the very difficult decision to abandon everything and to immigrate to the United States. My father was already here, and so we immigrated here to the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so those first few years of my life, we spent in extreme poverty, starting to really develop all skills. None of us really knowing English. And for many years of the beginning of my life, I was the interpreter for my parents. And really being able to learn firsthand those difficulties and those gaps in equity and those just overwhelming massive disparities between our community, my parents, myself, and the hopes and dreams we had for living the American dream. Fast forward a few years later to when I was in junior high, and for family reasons, my mother and I moved to Southern California. And in that space, I learned what it was like to have additional support, language access, and additional just programs for people like me who were missing that equity gap. And so when I came back to Washington, D.C. for college at the University District of Columbia, I brought that knowledge with me and that understanding from firsthand what it's like to experience a place that doesn't have that support, and then having that support and the massive quality of difference it made in my life. And I was very fortunate that my family had been able to gain access to a pathway to citizenship through Ronald Reagan's Amnesty Act. So this gave me additional privilege to come back and empower my community. So for many years before the Virginia Coalition for Immigrant Rights, I have been organizing and mobilizing in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I continue to do so today from an empowering place of wanting to see so many more people come up in leadership positions and to bridge that equity gap. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So many great points that really resonated with me there, but ultimately when we go through our diversity welcomes, it really just goes to show how personal experiences can really increase our knowledge of how we can show up for the community in a more equitable and just way. And the passion is really what drives the change that we contribute to. I'd like to introduce one more person who will be providing technical assistance and making sure everything goes smoothly today. Our Chief Policy Officer, Emily Griffey at Voices for Virginia's Children, who leads the work of our policy team. Emily Griffey. Emily comes to Voices with experiences in working on early childhood issues at a local and regional level for Greater Richmond's Smart Beginnings program, in Richmond City Social Services. and Baltimore's Safe and Sound campaign. Emily is a graduate of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond and earned her master's degree in public policy at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome and thank you, Emily. You are also invited to participate in the diversity welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with this amazing panel today. I really think it's a perfect way to kick this off, talking about your early experiences and how they shape who everyone is, because that is certainly what we're hoping to change here at Voices for Virginia's Children. I have to recognize, as a white woman, I come from a place of privilege, and it is my role to continue to be an advocate for children. I believe that to whom much is given, much is required, and that drives my advocacy for kids. I'm also a mom, so wear that hat as well. And I hope for my children that the experience that they have and that they grow up with is a little bit different than the experience that I grew up with, living steeped in a white dominant culture, and that their experience can really take from the diversity of Virginia. So I appreciate this opportunity to be here today. And Chloe, I'll kick it back to you for the first question.
Thank you. Now let's go ahead and dive right into the conversation. We'll each get an opportunity to discuss the work within each of our areas of specialty, the great progress and the challenges. Chidi, let's talk about your work first. And please, I'd like to invite other panelists to chime in if a thought or comment comes to mind. I often say I come from a speak and respond culture. So when others speak, it makes me feel a little closer to home when people respond. Now, Chidi, as the governor's advisor on trauma-informed care and resiliency and a member of the Children's Cabinet, what makes you proud of what the administration has accomplished?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and for giving me some space to talk a little bit about this. I know that when we discussed how this panel would go and what would be most interesting for a lot of folks listening in, it was that, that aspect of like throwback, Oprah style conversation would really be most interesting. I guess the new age version would be maybe red table talk or something like that. So the only thing I'm missing now is a cup of coffee, because I feel like that would have really added to the vibe here. Anyways, when I think about the work that's being done, I think in this administration, at least from my perspective, a huge amount of effort and leverage has come from our Children's Cabinet, particularly when we're talking about policy and practice change that has been most impactful for our children. So I'll start by saying that, I'm not technically a member of the Children's Cabinet. It's chaired by the First Lady. On it serves our Secretary of Education, Secretary of Health, Secretary of Public Safety, as well as our Secretary of Agriculture. And for many of you who know a lot about the different aspects that we focus on, it primarily revolves around food access, so ending childhood hunger, trauma-informed care, all of our efforts around early childhood, which our First Lady is so grounded in and has been the foundation of her work through this administration over the last 3.5 years. And then early on, we were really focused on public safety, school safety in particular, and that included school and campus safety. And so a major driving force of our policy efforts has come through the Children's Cabinet. One of the most awesome parts of that being that those meetings and the working groups were really a place where state government and our agencies could meet halfway with our stakeholders, people with lived experience, and those who really were so passionate about making Virginia a better place for our young people. So from, the space where I sit in the Secretary of Health office, I can say that I'm so proud of so many things. There's Medicaid expansion, there is our work in maternal and infant health, improving the outcomes for birthing people and for parents and children, providing doula support services where we knew it would be impactful, particularly eliminating those disparities we've seen for generations for people of color. Within education, I could elevate social emotional learning and the standards that were released this summer. That has been a long time coming and so needed. The tremendous work of teaching, but also responding to the needs of the whole child within the classroom environment, not just focusing on their academic development. These are just a few things that have been prioritized by this administration, but also some of our agencies, even before we, came into the work that we've been doing for the last 3.5 years. From trauma-informed care and our sort of resilience efforts, I would say that there's a couple things that have emerged from those discussions we've been having, listening tours, work group meetings, reports, what the research has shown, where other states have led and we have learned from. And that is primarily around awareness and acknowledgement, right? So understanding that childhood trauma is a real thing and that it is really pervasive, that it impacts an individual over the course of a lifetime. If you have no heart, you would be concerned only about the money, but it is very expensive. We know that many states have done the research and it costs, in the end, billions of dollars in healthcare to address things that happen down the road, particularly physical health, but also mental and behavioral health, all stemming at this root experience that so many people find go unaddressed for years. I say that when it comes to awareness and acknowledgement, understanding that greater recognition does not always equal widespread recognition. So the people who've been talking about adverse childhood experiences and trauma are often learning more and having more discussions, but that doesn't mean that people who've never heard about it are learning about it. And that is where we really need to make a serious change, is understanding we need widespread recognition. I recently heard of a hospital. Some folks came to the hospital to say, let's have a conversation with the leadership at this in this healthcare system around their response to trauma and screening and understanding childhood trauma and how that could impact patients coming through their doors. And they said, oh, we don't have a trauma unit at this hospital, so that wouldn't be a conversation we need to have. So that is like a perfect example of a problem we have, but also something that we can solve, because that still is a conversation that everyone needs to be having. And then the next step would be changes to policy and practice. And this is where I think we can say we've done a lot. We have many of our state agencies who have stood up trainings and professional development for workforce, specifically those who work with children and youth. There has been tremendous work done out of Department of Social Services with the Virginia Hills Project, providing a screening tool and training for that screening tool. Out of Department of Behavioral Health, opportunities for the ACEs interface training. So they have trained, I believe, almost 5,000 people statewide to become their own master trainers, talking about getting more word out. There's been a lot of collaboration, conversation with our trauma-informed community networks, which are the bedrock of, I would say, trauma response and resilience building at a community level within the Commonwealth. And just overall efforts to better refer people to services. So not just asking a question about what has happened to you, but saying, I'm sorry, and thank you for sharing that with me. I'm so sorry that happened to you, but that doesn't dictate who you get to become. So let's talk about how we can get you to some services or assistance that will best meet your need, the priorities that you have as well. Because what we think is someone's priority may not actually be what they feel they need most in this moment. So that, I would say are a few things that have been the work that we've been doing. And I could talk ad nauseum about this work, but it overlaps with so much of what everyone else is going to be sharing today. So I want to have an opportunity for conversation too. So I'll share a little bit more as our time goes on too.
Thank you, Judy. I appreciate that. The pandemic really put a stark emphasis on that intersection between cultural, racial, and historical trauma, whether even before the pandemic occurred. I know you were involved in work to combat maternal infant mortality. We experienced the wake of the George Floyd murder, amongst other traumas as well. What should Virginia do to continue to change systems that perpetuate trauma and inequity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that is hugely important to this conversation is understanding that just because something, if something doesn't say, oh, this is trauma informed, or this is, resilience is the title at the top of whatever project or whatever response effort or whatever bit of funding, doesn't mean that it's not trauma informed. Everything that is steeped in equity work is in and of itself responding to trauma and trying to prevent it in the future, right? And so I think it's so important that we connect the dots between the work of trauma and resilience and diversity, equity, and inclusion, and understand that if you are talking about interrupting our maternal and infant mortality rates, you are by virtue trying to build resilience in a community that has been disproportionately impacted by our healthcare system. If you are trying to embed social emotional learning and understanding of cultural differences in your students, you are by virtue trying to understand and better serve the individual, as Cecilia acknowledged, that is coming and arriving at your classroom and saying, you are valuable to me, you are important here, you are part of us, and we are part of you. All of that is part of the conversation. And then the more we put that in writing with our policy, the more we learn about it, but then change our behavior across the board is when we will start to see significant change. I would say that is, if I could say that's one call to action, it would be learning about the differences and then changing our behavior.
I heard that, really changing the way that we do the work, the way that we see the work, and really analyzing the impact of it. Do other folks want to chime in? I mean, trauma-informed care is quite intersectional, so I'd be interested to hear more insight from you all on how it shows up in your work and how you've responded since the pandemic began.
Well, I'll jump in. I really appreciate the way Chidi framed her remarks, because just because something doesn't have the tagline as trauma-informed care or resilience doesn't mean that it's not steeped in that. And I really agree, equity work is trauma-informed, because what we're trying to say is historical marginalization and inequities bring trauma. And what we need to do is begin to recognize that this is all of our work. And that is exactly how I think about the One Virginia plan. And in my work, as was mentioned in the introduction, the kind introduction, that this position that I'm in, this secretary level chief diversity officer position, what we've done is really thought about how do we reform our daily operations, the work of all of our state agencies that are happening for our internal workforce, as well as for the 8.5 million residents that we serve. How do we change that, our mindsets and how we do the work, so that we can improve the experiences of our workforce and the residents we serve? And the One Virginia vision and mission is exactly, has that at the forefront. At the beginning and the end of the day, we want to make sure that we make Virginia an inclusive state where all feel welcome to live, learn, visit, and thrive and work. And so it's not so much about just declaring Virginia as the #1 state for which to do business, which is great. We want to say this is where everyone wants to come live and learn and raise a family and feel welcome. And I love how Monica shaped her comments earlier about when she came, her and her family didn't speak the language. And so what is my charge? To make sure that as more people come to Virginia and choose Virginia as their home, that there is language access. That's one of the priorities of my office, because I can't imagine, for example, the Afghan evacuees coming in who may not speak English, the trauma that they're feeling. And as we welcome them into Virginia, we want to make sure we do it in such a way where they feel affirmed and safe and know that they're on a journey, towards towards healing and wholeness. And that's trauma informed, right? That is resilience building. The One Virginia mission and vision is all about reforming systems, structural and structural systems from a perspective of we haven't always gotten it right. And that's difficult for many people to think about because they say, well, there's no racism in my department. There's no inequities in my agency or on my team. And the bottom line is that inequity had a 402 year, right, head start. And so it's baked into just what we do and how we do things, so much so that it's almost invisible. And so what we need to do with the One Virginia Plan and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion is to make inequity visible so that we can do something about it. And a little bit later, we'll talk about some of the projects that we're working on. But Chidi, your remarks just resonated so deeply with me because I think that the bottom line is that while you don't have trauma informed or resilience tapped on everything, it's all of our work. And the governor says this all the time. It's not just the work that should be on Chidi and Janice in the administration. It's all of our work. And that's a difficult concept to understand, that trauma-informed work is all of our work.
I'd like to, I think these are excellent points, both two words that came to mind that each one of you used. One, Chidi used the word awareness, and Dr. Underwood, the word mindset. And I think those two are really key. The awareness will come as we understand each other and understand each other's histories, understand each other's cultures. And so in order to do that, we need to listen to each other's stories. And that's the awareness you were talking about. Overall, for all of our diversity, Virginia is becoming ever more diverse. And we need to have that awareness and understanding so that we can go forward together. And then the mindset, the mindset you talked about, the schools having more language ability and so the kids can be more fully feel comfortable and welcome. And that mindset has to be at all levels of the organization. It's the students and words matter so much. And what one person says one day to a student, I've heard situations, it's one phrase and it can be debilitating. And so having that awareness among students, among teachers, and the administration, and the same for all the organizations, having that awareness and mindset at all levels of the organization is so important.
Thank you so much. Just powerful remarks, and really resonates with me here at Voices. We do prioritize trauma-informed care in parallel with equity within our entire policy team. But part of what we've learned through the Racial Truth Campaign is that really community concept of everyone, empowering everyone to see a piece of themselves in the work and empowering them to lead in whatever and however they see themselves as leaders to lead change. And part of what the governor's proclamation outlined was that solidarity occurs when an entire community occurs. Solidarity occurs when one community member stands alongside the other when one experiences an injustice. And so how do we promote trauma-informed care and equity at the community level, whether it's through retelling of history or standing up when someone is experiencing an injustice? How do we promote justice within the nonprofit industrial complex and within institutions, and then also at the systemic level and policy? But we all have a role to play in this work. And so I hope we can really empower others to see their role. Now, Janice, while Chidi works within the trauma-informed care realm of our systems, we at Voices do find that this is quite an intersectional issue, especially as we move to address modern day impacts of trauma, such as racism as a public health crisis, and then other impacts of cultural and historical trauma that still impact today, although they occurred in the past. So your position, as we mentioned, is quite historical. What makes you proud of the work Virginia is doing today around diversity, equity, and inclusion for children, youth, and families?
Thank you, Chloe, for that question. I am proud about Virginia being ahead of the game. And we know, for example, the COVID-19 crisis and the racial justice protests of 2020 sort of galvanized communities, diverse communities of all, to really call for, and demand more racial equity across states, systems, cities, localities, the public and private sector, particularly government and law enforcement. In 2019, Governor Northam created this position ahead of the pandemic because he saw a need for this work. We have more than 100,000 state employees, and so our workforce deserves this idea of looking at systems and hiring and promotion and workplace culture from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. That does exactly what we modeled today about thinking about how do we leverage our lived experiences within and among our workplace cultures and teams and communities we serve. And so how do we show up with our authentic selves, understanding the intersectionality of experience? And that's just for our workforce, right? That's not even taking into account our communities, the 8.5 million residents, and even more of those who come in and visit and interface with our state agencies. And so this was a historical position. And while I was the first in the nation to be in this position, one of my goals when I came in was not to be the last. And so I've been working with the National Governors Association as well as other governors across the nation to say, we're calling for all states to have a position in the governor's office, much like the one that we've had and the governor created in 2019. Since that time, it's so important to understand that it's been our work to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion across secretariats. And so that's why I underscore this idea. It's all of our work. I don't have, while I have a team of 5, I often say I have 100,000 members on my team because all state employees must take up this work and really come with the expectation of advancing trauma-informed state government work. One of the major diversity wins was House Bill 1993, patroned by Delegate Alex Askew, which led to the launching of the One Virginia Plan. And if it's possible, Chloe, I'm going to ask one of my special assistants who's on to put a link in the Q&A to the One Virginia Plan. And you can share that with all the folks who are on the call with us. The bottom line here is that we are expecting all state agencies to drive diversity, innovation, and increased problem solving, and really increasing how we do our work towards diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence. Now, this is informed from a resilience perspective, that this is not sort of looking at it from a critical race theory perspective, but I just want to make sure that we inform everyone who is here that as we think about race and reconciliation, that is steeped in what's called critical race theory. And don't, whoever's listening, get it in your mind that somehow critical race theory is a weapon against those, for example, white people, but it is actually a tool that we use to look at our lived experiences. And One Virginia is all about looking at the collective so that we can bring our best selves to work and serve. Public service is all about leveraging diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the framework that we use is inclusive excellence, because if we can all agree that we all deserve the best and we all want to foster inclusive excellence, then I think we raise all boats, right? We raise all boats in the experience. And so another win from my office is the declaration of racism as a public health crisis. And thank you to all of you who are on this call, because many of you were part of really championing that House Joint Resolution 537. And I'll ask Diamond to put that also in the chat. That win really helped to say, okay, let's create a baseline. If we are declaring racism as a public health crisis in the same way that COVID-19 is a public health crisis, because we know for the last 402 years, racism has claimed more lives than COVID-19 will ever, then what we need to do is sort of make it less nebulous, because the term race and racism is often not only weaponized, but it's not well understood. So the Health Equity Task Force under my leadership, which is now also a permanent team of interagency leaders, we guide the efforts of public emergencies now. We created a mechanism that makes inequity visible and less nebulous across the exact social determinants of health that are mentioned in House Joint Resolution 537. And so, for example, while only a start, the two health equity dashboards, that mechanism that makes racism less nebulous, there's a statement in House Joint Resolution 537 that says, whereas systemic racism has manifested across determinants of public health through persistent racial disparities, and they mention in criminal justice, housing, education, healthcare, employment, worker protections, climate, outdoor access, food access, and technology, these 9 social determinants of health that the House and Virginia Senate have identified in House Joint Resolution 537, we need to begin to create baseline data to show the inequities across racial groups. And that's exactly what the health equity team did in the launching of the equity dashboards. It was a result of that declaration of racism as a public health crisis. How can we quantify it? How can we operationalize it? How can we make it visible for the world to see, so that we can now hold policymakers accountable for addressing at a minimum those first 9 social determinants of health? So the first dashboard is the Equity in Action dashboard, celebrates the resources that we've allocated across the COVID response. It actually celebrates and shows in a very transparent way the work we've done to help vulnerable communities that we know have been experiencing food insecurity, have benefited from Medicaid expansion that Chidi mentioned at the top of the hour, and even our PPE distribution. And so I'll have Diamond put a link in the Q&A box for you all, so that you can share more about the Equity in Action dashboard. But what's really exciting is the Equity at a Glance dashboard. That's really a call or a cry to action for us to examine ourselves across those same social determinants of health, to figure out what we're going to do about the inequity we can now see, right? What are we going to do? What are the actions? This dashboard now says dispassionately, without bias, here are where the inequities are, here are where those equity gaps you mentioned, Chloe, right, are. They are undeniable. They are synthesized at a state level across 133 local levels by race and ethnicity as well. So let me be clear. These dashboards don't measure health outcomes as many other health equity dashboards do. These health equity dashboards, they don't measure sort of vaccine usage, right? That's what the Virginia Department of Health does on our vaccine dashboards. But instead, they synthesize these social determinants of health, which is another way of saying racism, so that we can see where these inequities are, and then our policymakers can do something about it. This is the millions of dollars that are flowing into each state with the words equity on it. These are a tool, these dashboards are a tool, so that we can say, this is where you should invest. This is where you should actually make changes, so that we can serve the most, because that's what equity is, sending resources to those who need it most. And particularly, we know that in children and families that experience poverty, for example, need the most help. So where are they, and where do we need to direct those dollars?
Thank you. There was so much there to unpack, but one thing that I really heard and that we can often resonate with in our work is that people, when they learn about racism as a public health crisis or inequity and justice, there's often this pause, several community conversations happening, but what we find is that it's difficult to translate it to action, and that's what you've really done through your work in the governor's office. We'll also be sure to send these links out to everyone registered for this panel. And then in addition, Voices has also featured, which you mentioned today, in a blog. And so we'll provide that as a resource as well, but thankful that we're able to develop a roadmap through the One Virginia Strategic Plan for state agencies and able to analyze impact through the dashboards. Now, Virginia has received several or significant federal resources in response to the COVID-19 pandemic from the federal government. What has the state invested in, and what can we continue to do to ensure an equitable recovery in the future as we approach next General Assembly session and beyond? Dr. Underwood.
I'm sorry, I was muted there for just a moment. Yes, thank you for that question. It's so important that we get the word out. As I mentioned, Virginia has received significant federal resources to help fund an equitable recovery to the COVID-19 pandemic. What's important to know is that from the Biden and Harris administration, what they said is that they want us to build back better, and that's the charge of every state. So the ways that the American Rescue Plan funds will help us to build Virginia back better, to me, suggests that we know where we were. That was the baseline before the pandemic. We want to build back better before the pandemic. And businesses and residents across the Commonwealth will see investments, unprecedented investments, because we do claim the Biden-Harris administration as true partners, right, in thinking about this. So for example, more Virginians now than ever will have access to high quality behavioral and mental health care that they need, including strong community-based services from a local and state perspective. We've invested in our rent and mortgage relief programs, utility support. Rebuild Virginia has provided unprecedented support for our small businesses across Virginia, and early childhood educational financial assistance benefits, just to name a few, have truly been launched so that we can, for example, see dividends. We want to be able to say and measure, you know, this is where we were and then this is where we're headed, but then at the end be able to measure and show that we have truly built back better. So for example, right now, because of the governor's program, a college degree will now be more possible and attainable for thousands of Virginia students who would have otherwise been unable to afford it with our G3 program. Unprecedented investments are being made in our K-12 education sector simultaneously for our 132 school districts. So for example, including investments with ventilation repairs and access to learning supports due to the pandemic. Children in public schools will breathe cleaner air this fall as we open up our schools, keeping them safer when they return to in-person learning. So providing those tangible supports to our K-12 students and educators and families and communities is going to be so incredibly important. This is a generational opportunity and a result of what the governor calls strong leadership. And in Virginia, we are building back better. We're making those unprecedented investments with our General Assembly as partners, hand in hand, to build a roaring economy. And I just want to make mention, this is really important to mention. So our unemployment rate remains below our neighbors, but the other thing is that because of our strong leadership, the Commonwealth of Virginia has a historic $2.6 billion in surplus. So while other states are closing but have budget gaps, we are investing in Virginians in an unprecedented way. And we're consistently putting resources into helping families and residents and small businesses and communities to recover from this pandemic. and really prepare for the future, because another pandemic could be right around the corner. We don't know. And so we've got to begin to think about how do we build back better?
Thank you. And part of what really resonates with us throughout the pandemic is that some of the innovative practices we're doing now as a state, such as telehealth, such as the child care tax credit, those are all, and if I butchered that one, Emily, I know that's your specialty, let me know, but those are all significant investments that we can continue to maintain. And do we want to go back to normal? I don't know if we do. I think we want to continue to.
We don't. We want to build back better, because normal was traumatic for so many. If we think about 2019, before the pandemic hit Virginia, we had our first case in March of 2020, and some suggest even before then. But we were all experiencing trauma in different ways on a continuum. And so I think about those children and families that didn't have broadband access, for example, and then consistently anyway. And so when the pandemic hit, it just literally magnified those inequities. So going back to normal, whatever normal was, 2019 and prior, it's just not good enough for us. And we've got to keep the fight going because of that. So we can't change up leadership now. We've got to continue on this course towards race and reconciliation.
Thank you.
I was just going to add, I'm being mindful of time because I know we want to hear from everyone else, but I also think Emily would have a really unique perspective of some of the investments that were made using federal recovery funds, and where you feel from your perspective at Voices, the decisions that were made and the investments were made are going to best fill the gaps that we saw before the pandemic, right? To the point of building back better. I mean, you have a very, the portfolio that you all advocated for, which ones do you think are going to make the most impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to mention, our expansion of eligibility for childcare assistance right now through the end of the year, where that income goes up for families with young children. That's a huge opportunity. We've just expanded Medicaid access for undocumented pregnant women starting July 1. And we're hoping to expand Medicaid access for 12 months postpartum in the coming months. The child tax credit is a totally new opportunity of a monthly allowance that we've never had before in the past. This is the moment where we're seeing the possibilities, the potential and policies that we've never had the chance to have before. And so it really requires all of us to advocate for the continuation of these policies into the future to make sure that that equitable recovery is in place. So thank you for that question, Chidi. And I know we did get one question from the comments that I want to lift up too. And thinking about these initiatives, the trauma-informed care initiatives, the DEI initiatives, we're at the transition point to a new governor's administration. Are there things in place that you are working on to make sure that these initiatives continue into the next administration?
Well, I would love to hear actually from Monica from an activist standpoint, because as you know, as we transition to a new governor, many of us will be transitioning. So it will really be incumbent upon Voices and others who are in this space to continue to advocate for these initiatives, no matter who's governor. Mm-hmm. I have my bias on who I would love, to be governor, but I would like to share that, if we have demonstrated a good stewardship of Virginia and our resources, why change up now? But that's my bias. But I would love to hear from Monica and Dr. Barbossa. What are your thoughts on how you're going to continue to sort of champion these initiatives per Emily's question?
I think that's a good segue. Cecilia, a key part of the equity work is the inclusion as it relates to justice, ensuring all communities of color can survive and thrive in an equal society. What progress has the Latino Advisory Board made to respond to some of the challenges of the pandemic, such as economic trauma, healthcare? We did talk about language access, and I'm so glad that was included in the governor's budget this past session, and other challenges that impact children, youth, and families.
Sure, thank you. And I just wanted to explain the Virginia Latino Advisory Board advises the governor and his cabinet members and administration on issues of importance to the Latino community in Virginia. As advisory, we're a group of 21 volunteers. We're a very diverse group with many different experiences and backgrounds. And so just wanted to say we advise. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the research, our own experiences of the Latino community that we listen to, and then put that together. And I want to give a shout out to the various organizations that are on the ground, Vasir being one of them, with Monica at the lead, and Vacolau, and some of the other organizations, Legal Aid Justice Center and Southern Poverty Law Center, just to name a few, who also are advocating for policy changes. But some of the successes we've had, I mean, and both of you, all of you have mentioned some of them, I'm not going to repeat, but some of the ones mentioned: expanding in-state tuition for qualifying undocumented students has been one. Goodness, I loved hearing about the Medicaid expansion. Has been amazing. I'm looking forward to seeing how we can really, in all of these policies, I think it's really important that once they become established, that we really communicate out to the communities and make sure we reduce any barriers of access that may be there. We still have a lot of distrust in our communities, and knowledge and awareness takes time to filter, to get to these communities. So what we can do to really improve that and strengthen that is so important. So it's, in terms of Emily's talk about expanding the postpartum eligibility to 12 months is something that we're looking at, as well as the expansion of Medicaid to all children, regardless of documentation status. So that's also super, super important. So, and as well as the expansion from 19 years to 21 years. All these things are, I think, very important for children. The driver's privilege cards was something we advocated for, but many others worked on for many, many years. And it finally came through. Monica is nodding there. And so those were some of the ones that I pointed out. The rental and mortgage relief funds, great. I mean, there's been unprecedented at the state level, but also at the local level, unprecedented donations and money going towards the Latino communities, which really lends a different attitude, right, that we haven't seen before in communities, and really hope that this can continue. Again, I'd like to just emphasize access with some of our populations being undocumented, but let me just mention a few statistics quickly on that. You know, undocumented people in Virginia are 4% of the workforce, but 73% of undocumented individuals work in critical jobs. They contribute annually $1.1 billion in state and local taxes, and annually have an annual spending power of $8.7 billion. So just those are, I think, super important statistics to know, and I'm going to leave it because I know Monica has a lot to say.
Hey, Monica, feel free to chime in if there's anything you wanted to respond to. And it seems like you all likely work closely together.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm incredibly grateful for the support that we've had through multiple administrations with the Latino Advisory Board, and how we've been able to go ahead and see that growth and change happen as the diversity of the Commonwealth has continued to escalate. And we've seen that diversity. I think Voices for Virginia's Children sent out a very surprising statistic to many, but one that we all know very well, that 47% of Virginia's children are children of color, and how our state will continue to grow and diversify in all of these aspects. And we in the immigrant community also deal with mixed status families. And I think, people forget that sometimes we have multi-generational mixed status families where we have US citizen children, deferred action for childhood arrivals, recipient children, and undocumented parents or an undocumented parent, and how we are able to go ahead and see all those critical aspects of crucial jobs that are done by the undocumented community, and how that family aspect absolutely has a much larger imprint and impact than people realize from that initial 4% of the workforce. And so, I know we only have a few minutes left. So if you'd like, I can give you a little quick kind of oversight of VISIR and what has made us a little bit different than most other coalitions. So in the Virginia Coalition for Immigrant Rights, we're a completely unique structure, autonomous from any other immigrant rights organization in the country. And so for us, what that really meant is that we wanted to go ahead and make sure that our community members felt heard. When you're dealing with a community that has suffered trauma, multi-generational trauma, direct trauma, and especially their immigration process to the United States, to the Commonwealth of Virginia, so many of our community members have felt that scrutiny, that fear from government agencies, from employers. And so we wanted to make sure that we created a safe space for them to be able to go ahead and communicate to us what their biggest needs were to bridge that equity gap. And a lot of these conversations were had and created long before VISIR was here. And really at the forefront of that for many years was driving access, and how the undocumented community really felt a need that this would bridge the biggest need for them in quality of life, to be able to travel safely back and forth, to be able to provide for their families. And so the way that we structured VISIR, we created committees for folks to look at oversight and advocacy at the local, state, and federal level. All of these different committees have a variety of different members, and overall, VISIR convenes about 100 organizations throughout the Commonwealth that have an invested interest in immigrant rights. And so we noticed that over time, these grew and really changed in that creation of a safe space that sometimes some organizations and some community leaders had never really experienced. And I think that bridge of continuity and safety is critical to that bridging of an equity gap. And we see community organizations like VISIR, like our 43-member organizations, that providing that critical component, because as Janice said at the very beginning of this panel, disparity and bias had a 402-year head start that we still see perpetuate decisions today from many decision makers as we are trying to undo that. And just having the basis of a safe space where we have leaders of color and directly impacted community members of color coming in to convene and discuss what they need to immediately alleviate some of that survival mode instinct that they're currently living day to day is critical for our communities to be able to go ahead and see the light at the end of the tunnel. And so with VISIR, we really put a lot of effort in making sure that those directly community impacted members are the ones who make up the agenda. This means that no staff has any decision making as to what the VISIR agenda is. It means that members vote on it. And as always, we've seen this dramatic growth where, so many organizations feel this need and have still yet to make that gap in capacity, which we've seen over time. Virginia is not unique to this struggle. And, there's lots of studies that have come out, most recently from the National Council of Responsive Philanthropists, that show how under-resourced nonprofits are in the South, particularly that deal with communities of color. And just to kind of give you an idea, we gave a very impressive number at the very beginning that in 2020, VISIR and its members impacted policy that helped the change of over 500,000 Virginians. But the average nonprofit budget is between $250,000, $300,000 a year. And that's so small compared to the massive impact that these organizations are doing, that they come in with that cultural competency and that ability to create these safe spaces that we're still trying to create equitable from that 402-year institution that's still learning some of those things. And mind you, these spaces also come with a great deal of complexity, because you come in with community members that have a lot of anger and have a lot of frustration, all of which are secondary emotions because of primary trauma. And so being able to go ahead and create that safe space, helping them feel heard, navigating what those institutions are to go ahead and make sure that we are advancing in that American dream, is part of the collective struggle that we see and we continue to work on at Basir and with our member organizations. Thank you.
There were so many gems in that conversation, but I love the notion of creating, I don't know about safe spaces, but creating spaces for people. A lot of the themes that we've talked about on this panel is that sense of belonging, whether it was a sense of exclusion because of inequitable access to language or access to services in our healthcare systems and just other systems in general. So thank you. I do wish we had more time because there's a ton more that we could cover, but we're right at 12:30. So I just want to note, Voices for Virginia's Children is hosting Rally Towards the Future. We're re-envisioning the future and really living Dr. King's dream in commemoration of the 1963 I Have a Dream speech. So we are addressing some of what was mentioned today, such as covering all kids, regardless of their immigration status. We'll continue to tackle language access and family economic stability through some of those benefits that has come federally that we want to maintain. So please join the rally. Some of our priorities will be introduced there, and we'll make sure we get that link to you all as we drop it in the chat. But I just want to thank everyone. I'm so thankful for your time today, and even more thankful of the work each of you all are doing. One thing that really stuck with me that she said, Dr. Underwood, is that while your position is the first, you want to make sure it's the last. It's not the last. And so I do want to challenge everyone on this panel, if you happen to be in a historical position like Dr. Underwood or are serving as leaders in other positions, to really empower the next generation to lead so that we're ensuring that we're not the last doing this work. As we move into the closing, I'd like you to leave a word that inspires hope for the future. Those listening, some from the younger generations, are standing on your shoulders and uplifting the work. Others may be knee deep into their professions, but are often breaking traditions and disrupting the status quo in each of their fields due to their connection to their identities. Others may just be starting in their career journey. What token of appreciation or piece of advice can each of you leave them with as we continue to carry the work you all have started to ensure a just future for Virginia's children, youth, and families?
Well, Chloe, thank you so much. It's been so impactful. If I had to leave a gem for all those who are watching, whether you are beginning in your career or you are in the winter of your career, I advocate for the servant leadership model of being, that we must lift as we climb. We must make not only room, we must kick in doors to bring others with us and bring chairs with us to the table for these conversations to truly begin to take hold and take root. I believe that we are at our best when we, as public and even private servants and in private industry, if we edify with the servant leadership framework of being and serving. And so servant leadership is certainly the framework that is commensurate in my office, and I am a office of 5. So you see me in this historical role. I have 4 others who are serving along with me, and we all believe in servant leadership.
Thank you. I'll let others chime in. Cecilia?
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much. What a great panel. It's been such a privilege to participate in this. I'm going to pass on something my father told me, and that's the word curiosity. I think always having an inquiring mind, asking questions, being open to other new ideas is so important throughout your life. So I think if you can go through life with that kind of openness and inquisitiveness and curiosity, you're in good shape.
So I really love this panel. Thank you so much for putting this together. It was so wonderful to see so many, especially women leaders up here sharing so many gems. But I would definitely say that, you know, equity investment begins at home, and really understanding that, and really looking out, making sure that you have that safe, nurturing space internally, and how to help others gain that safe space internally to be able to go ahead and build that leadership up. I think that is completely crucial in many aspects and spaces to bridge that equity gap and really unify not just yourself, your family, but the community. Thank you.
I suppose I'll wrap us up, and I will say that hopefully this will tie all three of your final remarks together. I have a quote. I had the opportunity to travel to South Africa just before the pandemic hit, and this quote really stood with me. It's by Nelson Mandela, and he said, "There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children." And I think that if we can think about, you know, our children and the way that they remain safe at home, to your point, Monica, but also the way that we serve them as the adults that are here and responsible for stewarding them into opportunity as they transition into young adults, but also to plant those seeds of curiosity so that they can stand on our shoulders and make the world a better place. I think we will have all done our jobs and done well. So that's what I live by, and on my tired days, what I try and remember. So thank you, Chloe, for having me and for having us and for hosting. Thank you to Voices. This was a wonderful opportunity, and thank you to all who joined.
Thank you so much, Chidi. And I just want to empower others, even if you're, of course, not sitting on this panel, but still leading in community in different ways, that we all hold power. So we'll close with an ashe, which means the power to make things happen, or so let it be. Sometimes we also say an ashe, an acknowledgement of ancestors that we've lost, whether due to racism, COVID-19, or police brutality and other injustices. Thank you so much, you all, for making this panel possible and for sharing your truths as well as the work that you're doing. Everyone can keep participating in Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. Visit our conference page, www.vakids.org/RTRW conference. Thank you, and ashe, the power to make things happen.
Ashe.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.